I know. You're probably tired of it. Tired of coming to YouTube and being hit with those perfect stories. You know the ones. Videos with high-energy hooks designed to steal your attention, constant reminders to like and subscribe, and perfect plots that wrap up with a happy ending and a moral lesson. Well, let's get this out of the way right now. Here, none of that exists. I don't have a request for you to subscribe. I don't have a thrilling climax, and to be honest, I'm not even sure why I'm here. I am a medieval knight. My armor creaks a bit, which is quite annoying, and I'm currently mounted on a giant carp. Yes, a flying fish. I also carry a slingshot. Why a slingshot? Don't ask me. I just know I'm supposedly meant to save a village from a princess who has gone completely mad. Apparently, she's obsessed with teaching rocks how to sing. I don't know if I'm saving her or the rocks, and I have absolutely no clue how this is going to end. But if you just want to close your eyes and leave logic for tomorrow, then you're in the right place. The steel plate of the leg armor, which was currently jammed sideways against the dorsal ridge of the iridescent carp, had decided, about 40 minutes ago, that it smelled predominantly of forgotten laundry and a particularly aggressive type of lavender. This wasn't ideal. It certainly wasn't the smell one associated with grim, historic quests or even mildly serious journeys, and it did very little to mask the secondary metallic aroma of ancient coinage. Copper, specifically, the kind that had been handled by several generations of skeptical bakers. I adjusted my weight, which was difficult, because when you are armored in steel that heavy, the only thing you are truly adjusting is the rate at which your posterior slowly sinks into the substantial, slippery flesh of a massive, flying fish. The carp, whose name I had briefly known but discarded because it required too much nasal effort to pronounce, maintained its steady, unblinking trajectory through the upper atmosphere. The air here was exactly the texture of poorly mixed custard, warm and thick, and carrying the slight, humid residue of distant storms that had decided to cancel themselves. We weren't really flying, not in the way that birds or even the less ambitious insects understood flight. We were swimming, navigating the atmosphere as if it were simply a higher density liquid, and the sheer effort of this invisible swim caused the carp's scales to shift and ripple in slow, hypnotic waves of rose and oily turquoise. Every time the light caught the scales just right, it looked like the fish was having a profound internal argument about color theory, and I was sitting squarely in the middle of the aesthetic debate. I had long since stopped questioning the physics of the entire operation. Asking how a fish swims through air without gills burning up or fins desiccating was the kind of mental activity that led directly to headaches, and headaches were highly discouraged when your primary objective was passive survival until the next suitable sleeping surface presented itself. My name, which had evaporated from my memory sometime after the third cloud of questionable gray passed beneath us, was similarly unimportant. What mattered was the weight of the steel, the rhythm of the carp's silent propulsion, and the lingering, almost unbearable scent of floral metallurgy that clung to my greaves. My primary tool for intervention in this increasingly complex world was currently resting across my lap. A plain, slightly polished wooden slingshot. It was aesthetically pleasing, smooth beneath the gauntleted fingers, which was a nice contrast to the sharp corners of the steel, but functionally, it was mostly a ceremonial piece of confusion. The ammunition was worse. I had been supplied with small, perfectly spherical marbles of hardened sugar, crystalline and glowing with a faint inner yellow light, like tiny, contained sunsets made entirely of refined cane product. I reached into the pouch hanging off my saddle, if you could call a loosely strapped velvet cushion a saddle, and pulled out 3 of the marbles. They felt cool and slightly sticky, even through the armor. The last time I had attempted to utilize this weapon in any way resembling aggression, I had aimed for a particularly smug-looking pigeon sitting atop a faraway chimney stack. Instead, the sugary marble had curved gently, drifted upward, and then simply dissolved mid-air, leaving behind only the faintest, sweetest cloud of confectionery mist, which the pigeon had promptly inhaled with a distinctly satisfied coo. It was demoralizing, and yet here I was, still carrying 20 pounds of concentrated glucose ammo, prepared to defeat, or at least inconvenience, whatever awaited me at the village. The village. That was the destination, though the definition of destination was flexible, changing its meaning with every flicker of the Carp's massive golden eye. Sometimes the goal was to save the village from itself. Sometimes the goal was to ensure the village was moved exactly 3 inches to the left, which was apparently necessary for the princess's sense of structural harmony. And sometimes the Carp would blink, and the objective would simply become find a dry patch of moss and forget about everything until noon. I preferred the third option, but the fish seemed to be prioritizing the princess and her terrible aesthetic demands. Ah, the princess. Her reputation had somehow traveled ahead of us, carried on the slow, thick currents of the atmospheric soup. She was, as far as I could gather, obsessed with the impossible. Not just marginally difficult things like training a feral cat, but truly, structurally impossible things. Her current major undertaking, the one that necessitated an extremely tired night riding an airborne salmon analog, was the rock opera. For 3 years, she had been meticulously gathering the local geological specimens, the small, smooth river stones, the rough-edged slate slabs, the fat, round boulders, and demanding that they learn to sing Italian opera. They didn't have mouths or lungs or even the basic concept of pitch, yet she insisted, conducting them relentlessly with a silver teaspoon on the village green. The report stated that the silence was deafening, punctuated only by the occasional frustrated sigh of the princess and the scraping sound of the rocks being rearranged into choir formations. Now, because the rocks refused to sing La Traviata with the appropriate level of dramatic tension, she had decided that the village itself was positioned incorrectly. It wasn't the acoustics, it was the lean of the shadows. And to fix the shadow lean, the entire settlement, including the recalcitrant quarry, had to be translated precisely 3 inches west, but only on Tuesdays. I spent a significant amount of time considering the practical implications of moving a village 3 inches. It was too much for a slight adjustment, necessitating specialized equipment, but too little for a major, morale-boosting relocation. 3 inches is the perfect amount of movement to cause everyone to trip slightly on thresholds, to misplace exactly 1 item on a mantel, and to subtly but completely ruin every existing plumbing connection. It was an act of administrative madness designed purely to irritate. We are heading directly toward optimized geometric disruption. I mumbled into the cavity of my helmet. The helmet smelled slightly worse than the rest of the armor, having collected a faint essence of stale breath and highly localized condensation. The Carp didn't respond naturally. It simply shifted its massive tail fin slightly, pushing us higher into the purple haze. The light was doing strange things now, diffusing so completely that there were no shadows at all, which made me wonder if the princess would reconsider her demands when faced with a shadowless day. Perhaps she would demand the village be painted a specific shade of beige that only exists during a lunar eclipse. It seemed likely. The creak of my armor was a constant companion, a sad, repetitive symphony of metal fatigue. Every time I shifted, the steel voiced its low opinion of my posture, my mission, and particularly the presence of lavender oil in its crevices. It sounded like an elderly ship being nudged gently by a slightly smaller, more disgruntled ship. It was the sound of a very long Tuesday afternoon, stretched across an entire lifetime of questionable decisions. I tried to remember if I had eaten breakfast. It was an important question, because the energy levels required to sit inertly on a colossal fish while contemplating the structural integrity of a distant village were surprisingly high. I couldn't remember anything before the sensation of the heavy armor being placed upon me, that feeling of instant, comprehensive physical disappointment. I looked down at the slingshot again, tempted to launch one of the sugar spheres just to see if the resulting mist might be calorie-dense enough to count as sustenance. Probably not. It would likely just attract airborne wasps with a penchant for refined carbohydrates, and dealing with aggressive, sticky wasps, while covered in 30 pounds of lavender-scented steel, was a task best saved for a day when I felt significantly less tired. The strange journey continued. We were moving so slowly, yet the distance felt immense. The speed of the Carp was deceptive. It was like watching slow-motion paint dry across the canvas of the sky. I wondered if the Carp was tired too, or if fish, even flying, iridescent fish, possessed the complex emotional capacity for exhaustion. It certainly seemed to be navigating with the resigned competence of something that wished it was anywhere else, perhaps resting quietly beneath a cool, murky riverbed, instead of participating in terrestrial madness hundreds of feet above the ground. My primary focus, now, was settling my helmet into a position that would prevent the small, sharp rivet near my ear from rubbing the skin raw. This was a monumental effort, requiring tiny, infinitesimal movements of my neck, each movement accompanied by the familiar complaining screech of the lavender steel. I eventually found the correct angle, which unfortunately meant I could only look slightly to the right, toward the massive, golden scale just behind the Carp's head, where a faint watermark stain looked suspiciously like a poorly drawn map of a kingdom I once might have been instructed to protect. The whole situation had the distinct flavor of a poorly organized dream from which I couldn't wake up. The absurdity wasn't shocking. It was merely draining. I was a knight with no name, riding an absurd fish, armed with dessert, heading toward a princess demanding geological choral practice and geometric nitpicking. It was all noise and nonsense, and yet the commitment to the journey was absolute. I closed my eyes briefly, letting the heavy darkness of the helmet interior settle around me. The smell of lavender and copper seemed to amplify in the silence. It occurred to me that I had forgotten to ask if the princess intended to move the entire village, or just the foundations. If she was merely moving the structures, the displaced rocks would then be singing 3 inches away from the village's official coordinates, which could create a severe jurisdictional dispute. If the foundations were moved, the logistics multiplied exponentially. Either way, someone was going to be furious, and that person would probably assume the grumpy, heavily armed man sitting on a giant flying fish was responsible for solving the problem. This was precisely why I needed the nap. A good 6 hours of comprehensive unconsciousness would allow me to reset my mental parameters and perhaps convince myself that the slingshot was capable of launching something more robust than crystallized sucrose. Perhaps a small, slightly annoyed acorn. I opened my eyes, the purple sky washing over the iridescent scales again. The creaking continued. We were still moving forward, inevitably, toward the village of misplaced shadows and silent, high-art rocks. I considered shooting one of the sugar marbles at a fluffy, white cloud that looked particularly smug and cloud-like, but decided against it. Why waste good sugar? After all, if I couldn't remember my name, and the mission kept changing, and the fish didn't take direction, the only consistent thing in this whole weary escapade was the fact that I was going to need an enormous amount of energy to properly lie down when we finally arrived. And that effort, I suspected, was still miles, or perhaps mere inches, away. The journey, for better or worse, continued its slow, absurd crawl through the atmospheric custard. I have no idea what this story is about. That's the first thing I try to remember, usually right after I try to remember my own name, which always slips away like water spilled on highly polished, slightly damp marble. It is a useless pursuit, remembering names or plots, because the moment I grasp the edge of the thought, the massive, iridescent scales of the carp shift beneath me, catching the sickly purple light of the upper atmosphere, and the momentary distraction wipes the mental slate clean. I am a knight, which I know only because of the sheer, oppressive weight of the armor I am wearing. It's not a noble weight, or a comforting weight. It is the weight of a severe administrative error. It is dull gray steel, thick enough to stop a cannonball fired from a very, very old cannon, but it smells persistently of two things that should never share the same space: dried lavender and cold, oxidized copper coins. The combination is headache-inducing, a floral aggression battling the metallic tang of forgotten pocket change. I spent what felt like 3 weeks trying to determine if the smell was emanating from the steel itself, or if perhaps the laundry staff at the castle had simply used a highly unusual and fiscally motivated soap substitute. The lack of a conclusive answer is perhaps why I stopped asking questions altogether. It takes too much effort to follow a thought to its logical conclusion when the conclusion is usually because someone was tired just like me. The carp beneath me, whose name I believe is either Bartholomew or perhaps just the Great Fin, is entirely too large and entirely too shimmery. It looks like a retired rainbow that decided swimming through air was a better life path than refracting light properly. It moves with the slow, almost viscous grace of a spoon stirring honey that cooled off 10 minutes ago. We are not riding, we are floating, and the atmosphere feels like it's been thickened with poorly mixed custard. Every time the carp flexes its massive, decorative fins, the air around us ripples, and I hear a sound like old velvet being slowly unfolded. I am perpetually slumped forward in my saddle, a saddle that is slightly too wide and probably designed for someone with better posture and fewer existential crises, trying to achieve a level of rest that my current situation strictly prohibits. The only movement I make is the occasional small adjustment to keep the slingshot balanced on my knee. The slingshot. That is my weapon. It is made of simple, polished birchwood, entirely unthreatening and utterly ridiculous when paired with this armor. It is supposed to be incredibly powerful, forged in the fires of an elder god's misplaced enthusiasm, or something equally boring and mythological. But all I have ever used it for are the sugar marbles. They are small, spherical, and glow with a soft, persistent yellow light, tasting vaguely of citrus and disappointment. When I'm sufficiently bored, which is always, I occasionally send one lazily arcing toward a passing cloud. The cloud never reacts. It just absorbs the sugar light, and I am left wondering if I've just slightly sweetened the impending rainfall, or if I've simply wasted a perfect nap time snack. I imagine I'm not supposed to eat the ammunition, but the sheer lack of anything else to do, combined with the fact that my rations were mysteriously replaced with small sacks of coarse ground, unsalted rice, makes the sweet marble an irresistible tiny rebellion. We are, supposedly, on a quest, a mission of importance. The importance is extremely subjective, as is the objective. I am traveling toward a village, though whether I am meant to defend it, save it, or systematically dismantle its structural integrity piece by piece, I cannot quite recall. The instructions were relayed by a messenger who had the unsettling habit of blinking vertically, and half of his sentences sounded like static interference mixed with the sound of a distant bell. The village belongs to a princess. That much is clear. The Princess Esmeralda of the Crooked Shadow. Her defining characteristic, or so I was told by the vertically blinking messenger, is that she is utterly, comprehensively mad. Not dramatically mad, not shouting at the moon mad, just intensely, bureaucratically, inconveniently mad. Her current obsession, the root of this entire tiresome journey, revolves around the geology of her domain. For the last 3 years, she has been attempting to teach the local, unyielding field rocks how to perform opera, specifically the second act of The Marriage of Figaro, translated entirely into a series of sharp, painful-sounding clicks and abrasive grinding noises. They have not been quick studies. The rocks and the princess has apparently taken their lack of musical aptitude as a sign of environmental disharmony. This led directly to her latest decree, which necessitated my presence, or lack thereof, depending on the Carp's current direction. The decree states that every Tuesday, without fail, the entire village must be physically moved 3 inches to the left. 3 inches to the left. The stated reason, which the messenger delivered with an expression of stoic despair, was that the princess doesn't like how the shadows lean. I have been rotating this absurd concept in my mind for what feels like geological ages. 3 inches. It's not enough to be useful. It's too much to ignore. It is the perfect magnitude of inconvenience engineered to maximize communal frustration and minimize structural change. I picture the villagers, small and tired like me, hauling on ropes and levers, meticulously repositioning their homes only to have to prepare to move them back, or perhaps 3 inches further left, the following week. The sheer, pointless effort of it all makes my eyelids feel heavy, weighted down by the collective entropy of their pointless tasks. The sun here, what little light penetrates the dense violet haze we are swimming through, is weak and diffused. It doesn't warm me. It just highlights the dust motes clinging to the strange, lavender-scented metal of my elbow joint. I adjust the armor, and it lets out a protesting creak. A dry, rasping sound like 2 pieces of very old paper being rubbed together. Bartholomew, I mumble, or maybe it was the Great Fin. I'm too tired to check. Are we there yet? The carp doesn't answer with words, of course. It answers with a subtle shift in momentum, a minute downward tilt of its massive head that causes a cascade of iridescent light across its back. It's an answer that means, simultaneously, we are closer than we were. You should know better than to ask. And I'm currently reviewing last week's plankton harvest. Please wait. I sigh, a sound that is muffled and metallic inside the helmet. The helmet itself is actually quite comfortable, if perpetually dusty, but it severely limits my peripheral vision. I can only look straight ahead or straight down. Since looking straight down involves staring into the shimmering chaos of the carp's scales, I usually opt for straight ahead, which currently reveals nothing but the endless purple soup of the sky and the occasional lazily drifting piece of aerial flotsam. I start counting the flakes of dust stuck to my gauntlet. 1, 2, 3. I lose count around 7, distracted by the realization that I am still holding the slingshot. Why the slingshot? Why me? Why this specific permutation of exhaustion and madness? It occurs to me, not for the first time, that perhaps I was not specifically chosen for this mission. Perhaps I simply happened to be leaning against the wrong wall when the vertically blinking messenger arrived, and my apathy was mistaken for keen military readiness. They probably just pointed and said, "Him, the one who looks like he needs a good sit down." The truth is, I don't care about the princess, the rocks, or the alignment of the shadows. I care only about finding a structurally sound patch of ground, ideally one not currently being moved 3 inches to the left, and spending approximately 48 non-interrupted hours in deep, restorative unconsciousness. The air begins to grow marginally thicker, changing from the consistency of old custard to something more like slightly congealed gravy. This means we are descending. The noise of the velvet folding fins increases, and the rhythmic creak of my armor accelerates slightly, echoing my faint, tired heartbeat. "Ah," I note, articulating the observation internally, as speaking requires far too much muscle control. Progress. Then we hit the minor obstacle. It wasn't a mountain. It wasn't a sudden storm or a flock of aggressive, air-swimming seabirds. It was a patch of particularly dense fog, but not just any fog. This fog was structured. It was highly organized, moving with the sluggish deliberation of an overworked civil servant. It wasn't a casual mist. It was a deliberate, three-dimensional geometric shape, faintly glowing green, like slightly spoiled lime gelatin. It hung directly in our path, and the carp, Bartholomew, slowed significantly, his iridescent body shimmering with indecision. I stared at the green fog. It looked irritatingly precise. I spent a long moment, perhaps 50 or 60 seconds of real-world time, considering what this fog might be. In a normal world, it would simply be water vapor. In this world, it probably held a library of highly specific but ultimately useless regulations about vertical flight paths on Tuesdays. As we drifted closer, and drifting is the only word for our speed now, we were barely moving faster than the rate at which dust accumulates. I noticed tiny, shimmering, incredibly slow words forming and dissolving within the green depths of the mist. They weren't warnings. They weren't questions. They were statements of pure, unnecessary fact. The first word I deciphered, drifting past my face at the speed of molasses on a cold day, was henceforth. I blinked, a slow, laborious act within the confines of the helmet. Henceforth. What a word. It implies a change in policy, a pivot in procedure, a sudden bureaucratic determination that something must now be different, regardless of whether anyone wanted it to be or not. I waited for the rest of the sentence. It took approximately 9 minutes for the next word to drift into view. It was capitalized, slightly larger than the previous word, and glowed with a dull, sickly inner light. Fibonacci. Henceforth, Fibonacci. What in the name of the 7 forgotten smells of lavender and copper does that mean? I felt a dull throbbing behind my eyes, the slow onset of frustration that comes from dealing with the universe's arbitrary adherence to rules it just invented. I tried to focus on the structure of the fog itself, rather than the nonsense words it was generating. It was dense, but not entirely opaque, I could see the vague shape of the carp's nose pushing gently against it, causing the green luminescence to ripple slightly. The texture, if I had to guess, would be like touching forgotten cotton candy left out in the rain. Sticky, slightly gritty, and fundamentally disappointing. The carp, Bartholomew, suddenly emitted a low, resonant humming sound. It wasn't a noise of distress, but a noise of contemplation. It sounded like a large, decorative kettle coming very slowly to a boil. I realized the carp was waiting for us to make a decision. The knight, whose brain was currently functioning at the speed of drying paint, was supposed to navigate this metaphysical speed bump. I sighed again, the armor creaking its complaint. If it wants us to adhere to the Fibonacci sequence, I reasoned internally, it probably requires a specific series of movements. I tried to remember the sequence. 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8. I trailed off, realizing I couldn't remember what came after 8, and also realizing that applying mathematical principles to a sentient patch of glowing green fog was probably the ultimate sign that I needed an immediate, comprehensive rest. I gripped the slingshot tighter, which didn't help anything, but it was a familiar shape. Perhaps the fog required a payment of some kind. A toll. I reached into the small, dusty pouch attached to my belt, where I kept the glowing sugar marbles. They felt smooth and warm, vibrating slightly with concentrated sweetness. I pulled out one, a particularly large specimen, and held it up to the visor. It cast a tiny, sickly yellow glow on the green fog. "Is this sufficient?" I whispered, hoping the fog wouldn't demand, say, the structural blueprint of my personality, which I hadn't seen in years. Before I could launch the sugar marble, the next word of the fog's decree finally materialized, drifting languidly into position. Mustard. Henceforth, Fibonacci mustard. My tiredness achieved a new, profound depth. This was not a sequence. This was not a toll. This was a poem written by a malfunctioning signpost. This was the final, irreversible evidence that logic had packed its bags and left this dimension several centuries ago. I retracted the sugar marble. Why waste perfectly good emergency carbohydrates on fog that was clearly suffering from an identity crisis? I addressed the carp, slightly louder this time, though still muffled. "Bartholomew, I think this is less of an obstacle and more of a mood. I suggest we simply push through it and ignore the increasingly nonsensical regulatory demands." The carp hesitated for another minute, humming its low, resonant kettle noise. Perhaps it was checking its union guidelines regarding interaction with sentient atmospheric conditions. Then, slowly, with an air of profound resignation, it began to swim forward. The contact was strange. The green fog didn't feel cold or wet. It felt dry and slightly scratchy, like touching a very old photograph that had been left outside. It stuck to the lavender-scented metal of my armor, clinging persistently. As we moved through it, the fog began to generate new words at a slightly increased pace, driven by our disruption. The words started cycling faster, growing progressively weirder and more emotionally specific. Regrettably. Velvet. Perhaps. The hanot tukavta bin. Floss. I closed my visor tighter. The smell of lavender and old coins seemed to intensify in protest of the metaphysical lint we were collecting. I had no idea who they were, or why they regrettably chose velvet instead of floss, but I was certain the implication was damning. My brain tried to process the information, but it refused. It simply shut down the input stream, and redirected all processing power to determining whether the small knot in my shoulder muscle was caused by the stress of the mission, or simply the consequence of sleeping on a poorly upholstered piece of ancient furniture 6 months ago. The muscle won. The fog lost. We swam on. The thickness of the gravitational custard increased. It took what I estimate was an hour and 17 minutes to pass completely through the structured green mist of regulatory nonsense. When we finally emerged, the light returned to the standard sickly purple, and the air regained its slightly sticky, thin gravy consistency. I looked back. The fog was already reforming itself, the words beginning to slow again. I caught the tail end of a new formation. However, the late fee is considerable. I chose not to ask what the late fee was for, probably for disturbing its philosophical contemplation. I patted the enormous iridescent scale nearest to my knee. Well done, Bartholomew. You handled the philosophical traffic jam admirably. I felt the carp dip its head in acknowledgement and increase its forward momentum slightly. We were definitely descending now, moving out of the upper haze and into the region where things began to look less like abstract art and more like terrestrial geography, albeit slightly distorted terrestrial geography. The destination was finally visible, faintly far below. It was hard to make out specific details through the residual purple atmosphere, but I could see the general shape of a settlement nestled against a backdrop of incredibly tall, sharply pointed, and unsettlingly yellow hills. And then I noticed something very important, something that instantly confirmed every bizarre tale about Princess Esmeralda. The village itself didn't look entirely right. It didn't look organically settled. It was tilted, not tilted dramatically, not like an earthquake had struck. It was tilted precisely and meticulously. It appeared as though the entire grid of houses, fences, and presumably opera-singing rocks had been placed down on the landscape. And then someone, probably the princess herself, standing far away with a large stick, had pushed the whole thing exactly 3 inches to the left. The perspective was slightly off, creating a visual disturbance that was incredibly minor, but deeply upsetting to the eye. It looked profoundly uncomfortable. It looked like the architectural manifestation of a perpetual migraine. "Ah," I muttered, the armor creaking in sympathetic fatigue. Tuesday must have just ended. The carp swam closer, circling slowly like a vulture deciding if its dinner is worth the effort of the landing. We were approaching the point of no return, the place where I had to stop floating aimlessly and start doing something, which I found deeply distressing. My mission, which I recalled with a fresh wave of tired resignation, was to address the instability caused by the princess's madness, whether this meant convincing her to stop moving the village or dealing with the opera-singing rocks, which were reportedly threatening to unionize over the lack of proper hydration, or simply putting a polite end to the entire regime. I still wasn't sure. The briefing had contained too many mentions of dried figs and a sudden, passionate tangent about the tensile strength of decorative twine for me to retain the core directive. I squinted down at the village. The houses looked neat, but weary. They all seemed to lean slightly, not physically damaged, but exhausted by their own recent travel. And then I saw the rocks. They weren't just ordinary boulders. They were large, gray granite chunks scattered around the outskirts of the settlement. But they were all draped in tiny, ill-fitting silk scarves. Some wore monocles, balanced precariously on slight indentations. They were arrayed in groups, standing in what looked like painful formation, apparently awaiting their cue to begin their operatic chorus of clicks and abrasive grinding. I realized with sudden, chilling clarity that the princess was entirely serious about this project, and that dealing with operatically inclined geology was going to be even more taxing than dealing with henceforth Fibonacci mustard fog. I felt a sudden, profound spike of anxiety, which instantly drained my remaining energy reserves, replacing them with a vast, empty calm. Anxiety, I've learned, is only effective if you have the energy to act on it. When you are this tired, anxiety simply becomes a philosophical background noise. I reached for the sugar marbles again. One small, glowing sphere of sweet disappointment. I popped it into the slot in my helmet designed for ventilation, a repurposed hole intended for a decorative plume, and crunched down on it slowly. The citrus flavor was a brief, sharp protest against the metallic taste of my own armor. The Carp began a gentle, final descent. The landing was going to be tricky, as a flying iridescent fish of this size requires a considerable amount of horizontal space, and the village looked tightly packed, especially since it had just been manually shifted. As we sank lower, the sounds of the village began to reach me. They weren't shouts or cries of panic. They were, in fact, the sounds of intense, methodical labor. Creak, screech, thud, and the sound of someone whistling a very jaunty, completely inappropriate march tune. The villagers weren't fleeing. They were working. We descended past the rooftops, which were strangely flat and covered in perfectly manicured moss. Below us, I saw the source of the noise. It was Tuesday, technically, but clearly the princess's decree was not strictly sequential. A team of perhaps 30 people, all wearing matching, slightly stained beige jumpsuits and safety goggles, were currently attempting to move a particularly large municipal fountain. A fountain shaped like a sad badger holding a tiny umbrella, 3 inches back to the right, reversing the previous day's adjustment. They weren't using horses or machines. They were using massive amounts of decorative twine and a series of complex, brightly colored pulleys. The entire process looked exhausting and incredibly detailed. One man, clearly the foreman, was holding a large, highly polished brass ruler and a compass, meticulously verifying the 3-inch gap. I watched them for a minute, paralyzed by the sheer dedicated absurdity of the effort. They moved the entire badger fountain 1 centimeter. The foreman checked the measurement, frowned, and shouted a complex instruction that involved logarithms and the proper posture for rope pulling. I felt suddenly, overwhelmingly out of place. My entire approach, the vague premise of saving or destroying, felt brutishly simple compared to the subtle, maddening complexity of their daily life. They weren't suffering from tragedy. They were suffering from extreme, detailed administration. The Carp finally settled down onto a patch of open ground just outside the perimeter, near the unsettling assembly of opera rocks. The ground here felt solid, thank goodness, and didn't seem to be vibrating with the memory of recent movement. The Carp folded its immense, iridescent fins with a sound like 100 silk curtains dropping at once. I sat there for a long moment, the armor settling with a final, lavender-scented groan. I had arrived. I was here, and I had absolutely no plan. I was supposed to dismount and approach the village authorities, or perhaps the princess herself, or maybe just a particularly eloquent rock. But the prospect of moving the sheer bulk of my lavender and coin armor seemed insurmountable. The ground looked far away. I decided to try diplomacy first, or, failing that, just a nap right here on the Carp's warm, shimmering back. I focused on the nearest rock. It was a granite monolith, nearly the size of a small car, wearing a tiny, faded red silk scarf, carefully tied in a bow. It had a pair of tarnished brass spectacles perched precariously on a lichen-covered outcropping. It looked intensely serious and deeply disgruntled. "Excuse me." I projected my voice, which sounded metallic and hollow coming from the helmet. My voice felt unfamiliar, slightly rusty. "Are you rehearsing?" The rock remained silent, which was not unexpected, but the scarf fluttered slightly, as if stirred by an internal breeze of indignation. I tried again. "I am a knight, sent by someone, regarding the matter of the 3 inches and perhaps the matter of proper baritone projection." This time, one of the smaller rocks in the immediate vicinity, a pebble wearing a tiny, woven beanie cap, made a noise. It wasn't a click or a grind. It was a high-pitched, sustained swoop sound, like a faulty valve releasing steam in a forgotten kitchen. I waited for the translation. Suddenly, a voice spoke from behind the array of rocks. It was a sharp, clear, and immensely irritated voice, belonging to someone who clearly hadn't had nearly enough sleep. "He says you should address the maestro, if you have notes on the performance. And no, we are not rehearsing. We are staging a protest performance against the humidity level, which is causing scale slippage on the bass soloist." A woman stepped out from behind the large granite rock. She wasn't the princess. She was wearing the same stained beige jumpsuit as the workers, but hers was embroidered with tiny, highly detailed musical notes. She carried a clipboard and had a severely disciplined ponytail. She looked at me, this heavily armored figure astride a massive, rainbow-colored fish, with the expression one usually reserves for finding a particularly offensive piece of misplaced mail. "You must be the reinforcement," she said, her voice flat. "You're late. We started the Tuesday move at dawn. The shadows are currently leaning at a 4.7-degree angle, and the princess is refusing to leave her observation post until the Badger Fountain is precisely 14.5 feet from the eastern fence post. We need you to supervise the twine placement, and, for the love of the unseen deities, try not to scare the base section. He's very sensitive about his monocle." She tapped her clipboard impatiently. "And stop sitting on your transportation. It's distracting the tenor section. The iridescent shimmer interferes with their concentration on the emotional nuance of lament." I stared at her. Twine placement. Bass section sensitivity. Monocles on granite. I was not a hero. I was apparently an extremely late, poorly scented logistics operative in ridiculous armor. I looked down at Bartholomew. The Carp shifted slightly, letting out another slow, low hum, perhaps in agreement that the situation was hopelessly dull. "Right," I said, entirely lacking enthusiasm. "Twine. Are we moving it 3 inches left, or 3 inches right, or are we compensating for the displacement caused by the opera rock's recent shift in attitude?" "We are compensating for the Coriolis effect this morning," she snapped, adjusting the spectacles on the granite rock. "And, if you're going to be of assistance, kindly dismount, and put that glowing sugar lump away. It's high fructose, and the tenor is strictly low glycemic." I felt the immense effort required to swing my leg over the saddle. The armor protested one last time, a metallic groan of despair. I finally made contact with the ground, feeling the slight give of the earth beneath my metal-clad boots. The sudden shift in orientation made me sway slightly. The world seemed to wobble, caught between the gravity of the earth and the gravitational pull of sheer, exhausting nonsense. I was here, in the village of the perpetually moving shadows, among the operatic geology, holding a slingshot full of low-glycemic forbidden ammunition. I took one slow, deliberate step toward the woman with the clipboard, realizing I had forgotten my own name again, and the only thing I truly knew was that I desperately needed a nap. And the only thing standing between me and sweet oblivion was the correct placement of decorative twine, 3 inches to the left. This was going to take a very, very long time. I braced myself for the administrative horror of it all. It was only the beginning, and I was already finished. The problem with flying on a fish, especially one that seems to navigate using only outdated meteorological maps printed on the backs of playing cards, is that you never actually go anywhere quickly. It's less of a flight and more of a very slow, highly pressurized drift. I'm still perched here, smelling faintly of a laundromat that secretly deals in counterfeit currency. That curious mix of lavender and old, heavy copper. My armor creaks every time I breathe, which is a surprisingly frequent event, considering how little oxygen seems necessary for my current level of functioning. The Carp, whom I have mentally designated as Bartholomew, although I have no authority to name him, and he certainly hasn't indicated acceptance of the moniker, moved with the liquid laziness of something that has permanently forgotten what hustle means. He glides through the air, which, as noted, is textured like a warm, slightly congealed pea soup. It catches the iridescent sheen of his scales, making the world look like it was painted exclusively using the residue found in the bottom of abandoned teacups. Every ripple of Bartholomew's great, shimmering body sends a faint shudder through my spine, reminding me that I am, in fact, wearing several 100 pounds of poorly welded alloy, while sitting side saddle on an animal that should, by all accounts, be drowning. I spent a considerable amount of the last hour trying to remember why the slingshot felt like a good idea. It dangles from my hip, a piece of smoothed, dull oak. It feels entirely inadequate for, say, repelling a dragon, or even politely asking a guard to move aside. I keep reaching into the pouch and pulling out the glowing marbles of sugar, testing their weight. They feel like little frozen secrets. I've resisted eating them so far, mostly out of a tired sense of professional commitment. But the thought keeps recurring. If I'm going to save a village that might need to be moved 3 inches left because of shadow etiquette, maybe I deserve a small, neon yellow carbohydrate boost. The journey to the princess's village, or perhaps the Rock's village, or maybe just the village belonging to the shadows, has been unnecessarily protracted. I am convinced Bartholomew is taking the scenic route, perhaps because he senses my fundamental lack of urgency. The air here in the higher currents is thick with things that should not float. Stray wisps of static electricity, the muffled echo of someone else's distant yawn, and an alarming number of perfectly preserved paperweights. Just as I was contemplating whether the faint scent of cinnamon was actual cinnamon or just a memory trying to leak into the present moment, Bartholomew listed sharply to the left. It wasn't a sudden, frantic maneuver, but rather a slow, deliberate tilt, like a very large, bored fish trying to peer over its own shoulder. The motion shifted my center of gravity, causing my heavy pauldrons to grind against the breastplate. The sound was like 2 very tired boulders having a quiet argument about mineral rights. "No," I muttered to the fish, even though I knew he couldn't hear or process human language. "We shouldn't go that way. That looks suspiciously like Tuesday." The air ahead of us had changed. The soup-like atmosphere had dissolved, replaced by a dense, shimmering pocket of what appeared to be actively shedding textiles. It was a cloud made entirely of discarded sweaters, old velvet curtains, and perhaps the lining of several thousand forgotten pockets. It wasn't menacing, just intensely distracting. The light that filtered through this cloud was soft, fuzzy, and smelled strongly of mothballs and damp academic journals. This, I realized with a heavy sigh that rattled my visor, was a detour. I had stopped expecting things to be logical some time around when I agreed that a fish was a suitable form of armored transport. Bartholomew swam directly into the textile cloud, his iridescent scales momentarily snagged by a particularly ornate piece of beige lace. The sound of the surrounding material was a low, constant shh, like a collective secret being shared by generations of slightly worn fabric. And then we saw him. He was sitting cross-legged on a large mahogany dining chair that was inexplicably hovering in the center of the textile void. He was tall and alarmingly thin, dressed in layers upon layers of mismatched flannel and carrying what looked like a shepherd's crook, but the crook itself was fashioned entirely out of welded silverware. He wasn't herding sheep, of course. That would make too much sense. He was herding spoons, hundreds of silver and stainless steel spoons, ranging from tiny demi-tasse sizes to large gravy ladle spoons, floated lazily around him. He gently guided them with the crook, sorting them into small floating clusters. Each cluster, I noticed with mounting internal apathy, seemed to be organized by the subtle differences in their reflection capabilities. "Good afternoon," the man said without looking up. His voice was nasal and precisely enunciated, like someone reading the terms and conditions of a very complicated insurance policy. Just getting the tarnished ones separated from the ones pretending to be silver. They always migrate south this time of day, seeking better light quality. I remained silent. It seemed like the best defense against engaging in conversation. My mouth felt too dry to explain the lavender-scented coin armor or the fact that I was astride a massive, airborne freshwater fish. "You must be the knight of the erratic schedule," the spoon shepherd continued, gently tapping a teaspoon that was attempting to join the fork constellation hovering nearby. "I am Elmsworth, curator of unclaimed utensils, and, occasionally, a consultant for misplaced intentions." "Right," I managed, the word feeling gritty against my throat. I adjusted the sit of the helmet, which immediately began to fog up. Why was I here? Elmsworth finally looked up. He squinted at Bartholomew, then at my ridiculous posture. His eyes were the color of poorly mixed cement. "That's a magnificent carp," he stated flatly, "but highly impractical for cloud travel. The friction coefficient on those scales is entirely unsuitable for a medium composed of 85% woolen fibers and residual regret." "He seems to manage," I said, mostly because I felt compelled to defend Bartholomew, who at that moment appeared to be trying to eat a piece of blue gingham. "Managing is not the same as optimizing," Elmsworth corrected, shaking his head with the weary authority of someone who has argued the semantics of cutlery for decades. "You look weary, knight, and your armor smells of financial instability." "It's the old coins," I admitted, wishing the ground were closer or that this mahogany chair would offer me a seat. "They're sewn into the lining. Security measure, I think." "A pointless one," Elmsworth sniffed, nudging a soup spoon back into alignment with the rest of the constellation he designated as the Big Dipper's disappointed cousin. "Money is merely a symbolic placeholder for stress. You need something tangible, something useless perhaps, but historically significant in its uselessness." He reached into the voluminous folds of his flannel garment, which was either a very large robe or 3 shirts worn simultaneously, and produced an item. It was a piece of paper, thin, fragile, and folded with the meticulous care usually reserved for maps of hidden treasure or blueprints for complex machinery. It was, unmistakably, a receipt. "This," Elmsworth announced, holding it up like a holy relic, "is the great receipt of antecedent transaction. I have guarded it here in the Textile Nebula for 3 decades." I leaned forward slightly, instantly regretting the shift in weight. "What is it for?" "It is for nothing," Elmsworth declared triumphantly. "That is its power. It documents the purchase of 3 small tarnished brass bells, 2 ounces of concentrated quiet, and a singular damp thought about the migration patterns of seagulls. The transaction never occurred. The items never existed. The merchant was a concept. Therefore, this receipt is the purest form of administrative proof for non-existence." I stared at the flimsy scrap of paper. My eyelids felt heavy. This was exactly the kind of utterly meaningless item that seemed perfectly aligned with my destiny. "Why do I need this?" I asked, trying to keep the lethargy out of my voice. "It is vital for opening doors that only exist conceptually," Elmsworth explained, handing it over. It felt papery and slightly cold. "Or, if you prefer, it can be used to prove that your current problems are not actually happening, but are merely the echo of a clerical error made 3 weeks ago by a particularly drowsy celestial accountant." I carefully tucked the receipt into a tiny, dry pocket near my hip, where the sugar marbles wouldn't stick to it. I felt no surge of power or understanding, only a deeper weariness at having acquired a relic that only validated futility. "Thank you, Elmsworth," I mumbled, already signaling to Bartholomew with a slight shift of my weight that we needed to move before I was asked to help categorize the dessert forks. "A parting piece of advice. Knight of the erratic schedule," Elmsworth said, finally putting down his silverware crook. He paused, looking genuinely serious, which was deeply unnerving. "The princess? The one who teaches Rock's opera? Don't try to understand the libretto. It is written in a language that predates consonants, and it's mostly just demanding refunds for light pollution. Also, she's not actually crazy. She's just allergic to the letter R." I tried to process this information. A princess allergic to the letter R. Did this mean she couldn't say carp or armor? Does she struggle to articulate her own name?" I asked. Elmsworth merely shrugged, adjusting a tarnished spoon. "That depends entirely on how badly she needs a glass of water. Now, be off. My ladle constellation is achieving critical mass, and I need the quiet to calculate their trajectory." Bartholomew, perhaps sensing the rising tide of bureaucratic nonsense, angled his great body away from the Textile Nebula. We drifted out of the thick cloud of old jumpers and back into the purple haze soup of the upper atmosphere. The transition was marked only by the change in scent, from mothballs and regret back to lavender and old heavy money. I pulled the slingshot up into my lap, rolling a glowing violet sugar marble between my thumb and forefinger. I considered using the marble to shoot the great receipt of antecedent transaction, purely to test whether non-existent proof could be destroyed by crystallized sucrose. But the effort involved in aiming seemed too vast. So, I had gained an utterly useless item, proof of a transaction that never happened, from a man who herded migrating spoons. And I was now armed with the nonsensical knowledge that the target of my mission might be fundamentally opposed to the 17th letter of the English alphabet. I settled back down, the heavy armor sighing around me. The village must be closer now. I could almost make out the faint, high-pitched noise that might either be the wind whistling through high rocks or a choir of geological features attempting a difficult high C. I closed my eyes. Saving a kingdom seemed tiresome. Napping on a large purple fish, however, seemed entirely necessary. And maybe, just maybe, the sheer weight of the old coins in my lining would eventually drag us gently down to the ground. That was a finale I could truly look forward to. A soft landing, a quiet patch of grass, and several undisturbed hours of deep, lavender-scented oblivion. But knowing this world, we would probably just land on the princess's favorite, most tenor-voiced rock. And then the opera would begin. I have no idea what this story is about. Fallen 1. The world had devolved, hours ago, into a series of deeply uncomfortable, unnecessary physical sensations, punctuated by the persistent, tired query of what exactly had possessed the inventor of my armor to infuse the plating with oil of old coins and lavender. It was a smell that didn't belong on a battlefield, or frankly, anywhere near something designed to stop a swinging axe. Lavender suggests comfort, or perhaps a sachet left in a drawer of winter clothes. But when combined with the sharp metallic tang of aged currency, specifically currency that had been handled by perhaps thousands of sweaty, worried hands, it created a dense, cloying atmosphere directly beneath my nose that made breathing feel like an act of betrayal against simplicity itself. Every time I shifted, which was often, because the saddle strapped to the back of the enormous iridescent Carp was designed for maximum discomfort and minimum structural support. The heavy steel plating would creak out a tired, protesting sigh, and a new puff of confusing fragrance would erupt. The Carp itself, this massive, airborne freshwater anomaly, swam onward with the serene, unhurried pace of a creature entirely convinced that the atmosphere was merely a slightly cooler, slightly less digestible variant of the deep pond it had left behind 5 decades prior. Its scales threw off light in painful, shifting gradients of petroleum slick and fading sunset, and its massive tail fin gently sculled the purple haze that currently stood in for the sky. It was strange, the buoyancy. Logic suggested that a creature of this size and density, carrying an entire human clad in historical levels of misplaced metal, should plummet toward the ground at terminal velocity. But here we were, suspended in what felt like a warm, slightly thick pea soup that occasionally offered resistance. Just enough resistance to keep us from falling, but not enough to feel substantial. I often wondered if the Carp was actively thinking about this, if its fish brain was grappling with the fundamental paradox of aquatic flight, or if it simply assumed this was normal, and I was the odd one for expecting gravity to function according to traditional expectations. I suspect the latter. The Carp has an unnervingly arrogant demeanor, which is unsettling in a creature whose primary defense mechanism seems to be reflecting sunlight into the eyes of unsuspecting aerial predators. The only relief from the weight of the armor and the sheer absurdity of the journey was the distraction of my weapon. It rested heavy in my lap, a simple thing made of polished, dark wood and a thick strip of cured leather. A slingshot. It felt profoundly insufficient for the task of saving or destroying a village, depending on which mood the Carp was projecting into my exhausted mind moments before. My ammunition, glowing marbles of dense, compressed sugar, rattled faintly in the small leather pouch strapped to my thigh. I had wasted quite a few during the long ascent, launching them into the deeper purple clouds just to see if they'd stick, or perhaps dissolve with a satisfying pop. They did neither. They simply flew until they were small, distant specks of sweetened light. suggesting that even sugar had more purpose and direction than I did. I was contemplating the philosophical ramifications of using confectionery as high-velocity weaponry when the carp gave a low, rumbling thrum, a sound less like a fish and more like an elevator hitting the ground floor slightly too fast. We were descending. "Ah," I murmured to the large, reflective flank of the fish. "The village, I presume. Is this the one we save, or the one we need to negotiate the moving fees for?" The carp, whose name I believe was Bartholomew, or perhaps just Gulp, didn't respond directly, but shifted its massive body sideways, executing a slow, elegant, and entirely unnecessary air barrel roll. This maneuver effectively coated my left shoulder plate in a fine mist of aerial slime, which, predictably, reacted with the coin lavender scent to produce a new, terrible fragrance. Metallic, floral pond scum, I sighed. A long, weary exhalation that fogged the visor I hadn't bothered to close in days. Below us, nestled in a small valley that looked suspiciously like a forgotten chessboard, was the village. And it was exactly as mad as promised. The immediate observation was that everything leaned. Not slightly, not artistically, but fundamentally wrong. Every chimney stack, every fence post, every door frame seemed to be perpetually braced against an invisible wind coming from the northeast, despite the fact that the only wind currently present was the gentle, warm breeze created by the sheer displacement of Bartholomew's girth. The houses themselves looked agitated. One particularly stout bakery seemed to be resting on the tiny, mismatched wooden rollers, and as I watched, it jerked forward precisely 1 inch, then stopped, then jerked forward again. They were moving the village. It was Tuesday. "I suppose she really meant the 3 inches," I noted, adjusting the grip on my slingshot. The target was supposed to be moved 3 inches to the left every Tuesday, because the princess, who shall remain nameless because names require energy I do not possess, didn't like how the shadows lean. We landed with a surprising lack of fanfare, the iridescent belly of the carp sinking into the soft, springy grass of what I assume was the village green. The ground here felt strangely unstable, like walking on a very stale sponge. As Bartholomew settled, exhaling a plume of warm, wet air that smelled vaguely of plankton and disappointment, the villagers began to emerge from the leaning houses. They were stressed. Stress, I've learned, often manifests in peculiar ways in these isolated, highly illogical principalities. Here, it manifested in oversized, intricately knitted vests, worn over perfectly normal work clothes, and the universal clutching of yardsticks. A small man with a spectacular mustache, and the desperate eyes of a person who hasn't slept properly since the invention of the opera-singing rock doctrine hurried toward me, slipping slightly on the spongy turf. "You, the night," he hissed, his voice tight with either fear or the consumption of too many sour berries. "Are you here? Are you the one? Did the king finally send the adjudicator?" I tried to dismount, but the action of swinging my heavily scented leg over the carp's spine required approximately 12 minutes, and the precise coordination of my lower back muscles, which had atrophied sometime between breakfast and the third cloud marble. "I am present," I confirmed, landing awkwardly and immediately needing to brace myself against the carp's flank. The coin lavender smell surged aggressively. "I have been sent to address the leaning issue, and perhaps the singing." "The leaning is secondary, sir, or madam, or whatever you are beneath that terrible aroma," the man whispered, frantically tugging at the edge of his knitted vest. "It's the measurement. It is Tuesday. The princess requires a 3-inch lateral displacement. She specifically demanded that the entire village be moved precisely 3 inches to the geometric left of its current coordinates, measured from the northernmost boundary marker, which is, unfortunately, inside the opera practice grounds. I blinked slowly, processing the logistics. So you have to move the whole town 3 inches? Yes, and we tried. We used the rollers. But Sir Reginald, the master of measurement, insists that we only achieved 2 7/8 inches. The princess is currently staging a very aggressive sit-in near the central fountain, demanding that the rocks be given extra water rations as punishment for our incompetence. And the rocks? They are singing louder than ever. They are reaching soprano registers that are simply unsustainable for inert, igneous material. I looked toward the center of the village. Indeed, there was a small crowd gathered around a collection of large gray stones arranged in a semicircle. A high, slightly gravelly, but undeniably musical tone emanated from the cluster. It sounded like a choir of very old, very disappointed grandmothers attempting to hit notes that haven't existed since the Renaissance. "They sound stressed," I commented, adjusting the leather strap of my slingshot. "They are always stressed. That is their operatic style. Tragedy, Sir Knight, but the volume is interfering with the princess's concentration on the leaning of the shadows." I felt exhaustion creeping up my legs, a heavy, molasses-thick sensation that promised immediate, deep oblivion if I would just lean against something supportive. Dealing with logistical madness and geological talent was far too much effort. I was looking for a nap, and this level of sonic and architectural chaos was antithetical to rest. "Take me to the princess," I ordered, though the voice that came out sounded less commanding and more like dry toast crumbling into dust. The small man, who introduced himself, unnecessarily, as Barnaby, Chief Metrics Adjuster, 3rd Class, led me deeper into the village. Every step was a careful exercise in weight distribution, ensuring my lavender-infused bulk didn't sink through the spongy earth. The princess was exactly where Barnaby said she was, perched precariously atop the edge of the fountain, surrounded by nervous courtiers and the aggressively singing rocks. She was surprisingly young, wearing a dress made entirely of dried hydrangeas, and held a meticulously sharpened pencil like a ceremonial scepter. She looked up as I approached, her eyes wide, unfocused, and intensely dedicated to an invisible problem. "You're late," she announced, her voice high and clear, cutting through the rocky cacophony. "It is 3:47 p.m. The shadows have leaned 3 degrees too far to the west since 3:30. This asymmetry is causing structural damage to my mood. And what is that smell? Is that metallic regret and potpourri?" "It's my armor, Your Highness," I replied, bowing only slightly, lest the weight of the steel snap my spine entirely. "I understand there is an issue with the lateral displacement of the entire township?" "Incompetence," she declared, stabbing the air with her pencil. "Barnaby's team managed only 2 7/8 inches. Do they not understand the fundamental truth of the 3-inch principle? Do they think the shadows will wait for their lack of mathematical rigor? And listen to the chorus. The rocks are punishing me for their failures." The rocks, a group that included one particularly large granite boulder that seemed to be managing a powerful, resonant baritone, were indeed singing with escalating fervor. The granite boulder was currently hitting a sustained high A that vibrated the fillings in my teeth. "They need to quiet down," I muttered, rubbing my temples beneath the visor. "And the village needs to stay put, moving things 3 inches every week seems counterproductive to the foundation's longevity. "But the lean," the princess insisted, sliding off the fountain and pointing an accusatory finger at a perfectly normal, sun-drenched shadow cast by the bakery, which had just achieved its final 1/8 inch of movement and was now stationary. "Look, that shadow is displaying overt insubordination. It is stretching its limbs too far." I stared at the shadow. It looked perfectly mundane, just a dark patch on the ground reflecting the lack of light where the sun was blocked by the wall. But to the princess, it was an offense worthy of geologic opera. This was the climax, I realized with a wave of heavy resignation. This was the moment I was supposed to use my training, my absurd, expensive armor, and my complete lack of a plan to resolve this political geological crisis. But I was too tired. The armor was too heavy. The carp was probably asleep behind me, and the noise from the igneous chorus was making my brain feel like dry sponges. The solution, therefore, couldn't be complex. It had to be immediate, quiet, and preferably involve me lying down very soon. I reached into the leather pouch and pulled out 3 of the glowing sugar marbles. They pulsed faintly in my gloved hand, warm and sweet-smelling, a scent that, blessedly, temporarily overwhelmed the lavender and coins. The princess was currently lecturing the granite boulder about the proper use of vibrato in times of social unrest. Barnaby was weeping quietly behind a potted shrub. The other villagers stood frozen, yardsticks clutched like prayer beads. I raised the slingshot. I was not aiming at the princess. I was not aiming at the villagers. I was not even aiming at the shadows, which seemed to be the root cause of all the emotional distress. I was aiming at the granite boulder, not to destroy it, of course. My slingshot was designed for scattering, for soft, temporary distractions, not violence. I pulled back the leather pouch, the sugar marble settling perfectly into the cradle. I aimed high, accounting for the surprisingly significant air resistance of the soup atmosphere at ground level. Thwang. The marble shot forward, a glowing comet of pure sucrose. It didn't strike the granite boulder directly. Instead, it sailed slightly past, hitting the adjacent limestone rock, the one that had been managing the annoying, piercing countertenor, with a soft, sticky thwack. The limestone rock immediately sputtered. Its high note wavered, then stopped entirely. The glowing marble, being highly concentrated refined sugar, didn't shatter. It adhered, melting slightly against the warm stone surface. Silence, a small, perfect, glorious silence, broken only by the heavy breathing of the granite baritone. The princess froze mid-sentence. She looked not at the rock or the night, but at the sticky spot of glowing sugar. "Oh," she whispered, "it's sparkling." The silence held for perhaps 30 seconds, which, after the incessant geological opera, felt like a millennia of peace. Then the granite boulder, sensing the sudden unplanned hiatus, began to sing again, but its voice seemed weaker, confused. I quickly loaded the second marble. I aimed this one for the baritone. Thwang. It hit the granite boulder squarely on its massive, mossy face. The sugar marble adhered instantly. The baritone cut off abruptly. There was a faint sound, perhaps the sound of minerals being coated in simple carbohydrates, and then nothing. The third marble was aimed at a smaller cluster of sedimentary stones that had been trying to maintain a deep, rumbling bass line. Thwang. Silence. The entire rocky choir was now coated in 3 patches of glowing, slightly sticky, intensely sweet refined sugar. They were utterly silent. The princess didn't look angry. She looked mesmerized. She slid down the fountain entirely and approached the now silent stones cautiously. "The sugar," she breathed, running a finger near the edge of the glowing patch on the limestone. "It tastes like success." Barnaby crept out from behind the shrub, his yardstick trembling. "Your Highness, the singing has ceased. The asymmetry of the shadows remains, but the noise—" "Nonsense, Barnaby," the princess said dismissively, licking her finger. "The singing was merely distracting us from the true problem. These rocks needed flavor. They needed purpose beyond tragedy. The knight, with his terrible-smelling armor, has provided a sweet conclusion." She turned to me, her eyes sparkling, no longer with madness, but with the temporary euphoria of a child discovering a new toy. "Knight who smells of pennies and blossoms. You have solved the sonic problem. The rocks are sweetened. They can rest now. And if the rocks can rest, perhaps the shadows will feel less rebellious. I shall declare this the official 3-inch day of rest and sucrose adhesion." She pointed to the newly silenced granite boulder. "That one shall henceforth be known as the caramel baritone. I must commission a treatise on the effects of simple sugars on operatic tension." The crisis, the grand geopolitical, architectural, musical threat, had evaporated in a puff of sugar dust and sticky relief. It wasn't solved, of course, because the village was still exactly 2 7/8 inches displaced, and the shadows were still leaning too far west for her emotional comfort. But the distraction of novel, glowing confectionery had completely superseded the previously critical issues. Barnaby let out a gasp of air that sounded suspiciously like freedom, and immediately began measuring the amount of sticky residue, probably for official documentation. I felt the immense wave of exhaustion return, now exponentially worse, weighted down by the realization that my heroic duty had been fulfilled by providing dessert to inanimate objects. The only remaining task was my primary, essential goal. "Your Highness," I rasped, leaning heavily on the slingshot. "I believe the situation is now stable enough for a brief period of restorative stasis." Yes, stasis." The princess waved her hand dismissively, already completely engrossed in plotting the next stage of her sugar rock experimentation. "Go rest, Knight. Perhaps find a nice, dim corner where your awful smell won't interfere with the new, subtle sweetness of the landscape. We shall need you next week when the shadows inevitably begin to practice the tango." I didn't need to be told twice. I didn't need to ask permission or direction or even find out my name. All I needed was a low, quiet space. I turned and walked back toward where Bartholomew the Carp was resting, already submerged halfway into the spongy earth, looking deeply satisfied with his decision to stop flying. His massive, damp body provided a convenient, temporary shelter. I located a spot underneath his shimmering, petroleum-colored tail fin. The ground here was slightly firmer, and the thick fin provided an immediate, overwhelming, damp shade. It still smelled faintly of plankton, but it was a neutral, natural smell, vastly preferable to the oppressive, metallic, floral horror emanating from my own torso. I carefully leaned the slingshot against the tail fin. The sugar marbles rattled their silent protest in the pouch. The armor pressed into the soft dirt, heavy, cumbersome, smelling faintly of a disastrous retirement fund and a very poor life decision involving laundry detergent. I didn't bother trying to take it off. That would require effort, and effort was an enemy of the current objective. I simply folded my arms, resting the lavender coin-scented gauntlets against the slightly iridescent breastplate. I could still hear the princess faintly, directing Barnaby to procure icing sugar for enhanced operatic textures. But the sound was muffled, distant, dissolving into the warm soup of the afternoon air. The world outside my temporary sanctuary was still mad, still nonsensical, still revolving around the demands of an illogical princess and the singing aspirations of some very sticky stones. The village was still slightly off-center, but here, beneath the shimmering safety of a giant flying fish, the only truth that mattered was the blissful, numbing weight of the steel and the profound, beautiful emptiness of needing nothing at all. I closed my eyes. The last thought I had before the heavy lavender coin fog of exhaustion finally claimed me was a quiet, satisfied realization. I had traveled across the thick, purple atmosphere on a swimming fish to silence some rocks with candy. And it had worked perfectly. Tomorrow, perhaps, I would worry about the tangoing shadows. But not now. Now, there was only the deep, heavy peace of a completely unnecessary victory. The armor settled. The scent faded slightly into the cool dampness, and the knight, whose name no one remembered, finally found his nap. The iridescent scales of the carp caught the last smear of purple light the atmosphere was offering, and, frankly, I was starting to regret having left the relative peace of whatever damp cellar I was pulled from. The air up here, which I had previously described as a thick, warm soup, had begun to curdle slightly, developing a textural grit that chafed against the dull, heavy steel of my armor. The steel itself was a remarkable piece of engineering, mostly because it managed to smell perpetually of two things that should not mix: ancient, dust-covered copper coins and industrial-strength lavender soap. It was a scent that suggested either deep historical poverty or a very enthusiastic cleaning regimen by someone who misunderstood hygiene entirely. I shifted my weight on the fish's broad, slick back, and the sound echoed the misery of my joints. Creak, clank, shh. That last sound was the sound of the old coins rustling against the fabric underneath the breastplate. A subtle, constant reminder of potential collateral damage if I ever moved too quickly. I didn't move quickly. I hadn't moved quickly in years, perhaps not since I forgot my own name somewhere between Tuesday and a long stretch of extremely flat road. The carp, whose name I believe was Barnaby, though Barnaby seemed to respond equally well to thin face, and, oh, for heaven's sake, began its slow, spiraling descent. We were entering the visual sphere of the village. It looked, precisely as forewarned, fundamentally wrong. The issue wasn't the layout, exactly, but the placement. The entire settlement sat on a slight, almost imperceptible tilt, as if someone had nudged a giant, intricate chessboard during a long, tedious game. The roof lines didn't quite align with the horizon, and the well in the center of the square looked like it was trying very hard to slide away to the left. This was, I recalled through the thick sludge of my exhaustion, the result of the princess demanding the town be moved 3 inches to the left every Tuesday. Today was probably Wednesday, judging by the quality of the air and the collective sigh rising from the chimneys, meaning the town had just endured a lateral trauma the day prior and was currently settling into a temporary, uneasy residency. My armor weighed heavily on my shoulders, a comforting pressure that prevented my skull from floating off into the endless, incomprehensible violet haze we'd been navigating. The slingshot, made of a pleasantly worn piece of knotty oak, hung loosely from my right hand. It felt entirely insufficient for solving geopolitical crises, but excellently suited for causing minor, aesthetically pleasing interruptions. "Barnaby," I muttered into the thick, humid air, which tasted faintly of electrified moss and regret. "We are landing. Please try not to land directly on the opera rocks. They sound stressed enough." Barnaby responded with a rhythmic, pulsing flicker of his iridescent scales, a silent, luminous shrug. His method of locomotion wasn't flapping. It was a slow, deliberate swimming through the atmosphere, pushing the thick air aside with his pectoral fins. The displacement felt like being dragged slowly through warm honey, requiring an immense, almost spiritual commitment to not falling off. The final few yards of the descent were agonizing. I focused entirely on the logistics of dismounting the giant flying fish, while encased in 90 pounds of lavender-scented coinage. The grass looked soft, but deceitful, as we touched down with a gentle, oily thwump. Just outside the tilted perimeter, I noticed the rocks. They were everywhere. Large, gray, sedimentary rocks, positioned individually on small, velvet-covered stands, arranged in what looked like the world's most demanding choir formation. They weren't just rocks, they were the opera troupe. I managed to slide off Barnaby's back, my armored feet finding the slightly skewed ground. The clank was loud, immediate, and drew the attention of the nearest rock, which looked suspiciously like a slightly overgrown boulder attempting to maintain a severe, judging expression. A small delegation of villagers was already approaching, moving with the careful, slightly unbalanced gait of people constantly worried about tripping over invisible 3-inch shifts. They were silent, their faces worn smooth by years of cultural mandates regarding operatic geology and mandatory municipal relocation. "Welcome," said the oldest villager, a woman whose apron was pinned with tiny, decorative tuning forks. Her voice was flat, practiced. "You must be the solution." I adjusted my helm. The movement caused the heavy steel to grind against my collarbone, a sound like a distant, angry glacier. "I am a knight," I informed her, "or possibly just an extremely well-armored delivery man." The paperwork was unclear. Regarding the solution, I mostly specialize in distraction via crystallized sugar. I held up the slingshot, letting a glowing blue marble of hardened sugar catch the fading light. It smelled vaguely of peppermint and forgotten childhood dreams. The woman's eye twitched slightly. "The princess is waiting. She is currently having a philosophical disagreement with a nice about the proper use of vibrato." I sighed, a long, rattling breath that tasted strongly of lavender. This was exactly the sort of problem that demanded a long nap, not an immediate confrontation. But the armor was already hot, and the ground was irritatingly uneven. "Lead the way," I said, trying to infuse my voice with authority, but mostly achieving a low, tired drone. We walked across the unsettlingly angled village square. The sun had almost fully committed to sinking, and the shadows were, indeed, causing an uproar. They were long, slender, and leaned fiercely to the right, contradicting the overall leftward tilt of the village. I understood the princess's frustration. The entire visual plane was suffering from conflicting existential directions. The princess was sitting not in a castle, but on a large, intricately carved rocking chair, placed squarely in the center of the singing rock formation. She was young, dressed in complicated layers of moth-eaten silk, and was perhaps the only person in the village who looked completely rested. She held a conductor's baton made entirely of highly polished licorice. "The bismuth refused the counterpoint again," she announced immediately, pointing the licorice baton accusingly at a glittering, crystalline rock perched high on a makeshift stage. And just look at the shadow. It's leaning with such aggressive entitlement. It suggests an unearned confidence, Sir Knight. We must discourage such arrogance. I stood silently for a long moment, letting the sheer weight of the situation settle in the pit of my stomach, right beside the growing realization that I hadn't eaten anything sensible in several days. Just sugar marbles, occasionally chewed if I felt energetic enough to remove my gauntlets. "Princess," I began, my voice slow and heavy, as if pulling each word up from a deep, forgotten well. "It is generally the nature of shadows to lean, particularly when the angular velocity of the planetary rotation is entering its twilight phase, causing refraction anomalies in the lower atmosphere." She blinked at me, her eyes wide and unnervingly clear. "Lies. Shadows are reflections of intention. This shadow," she tapped her foot lightly, "intends to imply that I should have positioned the village 4 inches to the left, not 3. It is a criticism, Knight, and I do not accept critique from immaterial visual distortions." This was the crux of the matter. The problem wasn't the town, or the rocks, or even the princess's mental state. The problem was the princess's intense relationship with metaphysical architectural criticism offered by sunlight. "Perhaps," I suggested, running a gloved thumb over the smooth, hard surface of the slingshot's marble pouch, "we can change the shadow's perception of itself." She leaned forward, intrigued. The rocking chair squeaked, a sound instantly drowned out by a low, grating rumble from one of the sedimentary boulders, possibly an attempt at a baritone arpeggio. "How does one alter the perception of an immaterial visual distortion?" she asked. "By giving it something else to look at," I said simply. I reached into the leather pouch at my hip and extracted 4 of the largest sugar marbles I possessed. They were slightly sticky, glowing with a soft, persistent internal light. 1 emerald green, 1 fiery orange, 1 sapphire blue, and 1 a rather aggressive shade of magenta. I carefully loaded the slingshot with the emerald marble. This required intense focus, as the heavy steel gauntlet made everything feel enormous and clumsy. My arm ached immediately from the effort of pulling the thick rubber band. "The shadow is concerned with linearity," I explained to the princess, ignoring the muttering villagers and the low, droning complaint emanating from a piece of obsidian. "It is concerned with the ground and the angle of the perpendicular. We must introduce vertical chaos." With a soft thwip, the emerald sugar marble launched into the darkening sky. It flew in a sharp, high arc, the internal glow growing brighter as it reacted to the colder air layers above. It wasn't fast, but it was persistent. The princess, the villagers, and even the rocks, whose subtle movements suggested deep fascination, tilted their heads upward to follow the trajectory of the glowing sweep. I waited until the first marble was nearing its zenith before loading the second, the orange one. Thwip, then the blue one. Thwip, then the magenta one, which I aimed slightly higher than the others. Thwip. Now, the sky above the tilted village was marked by 4 slow-moving, intensely colored points of sugar light, hovering, orbiting, and gently scattering their light across the immediate landscape. The effect on the shadows was immediate, but not physical. The original, judgmental shadows of the buildings remained, long and sharp, but they were now overlaid with 4 additional, softer, rapidly intersecting bands of colored light, blurring their definition and destroying their singular, critical perspective. The magenta marble, in particular, cast a hue that made the original shadow appear slightly ridiculous, less a critique and more a misplaced smudge. The princess stared up at the spectacle, her mouth slightly ajar. "They are orbiting," she whispered, sounding less mad scientist and more profoundly enchanted. "They are providing an alternative, saccharine geometry." "Exactly," I confirmed, letting the slingshot drop to my side, the weight of the effort already pulling me toward profound sleep. The shadow can no longer focus on the simple tyranny of the sun's angle. It is now forced to contend with 4 glowing, high-velocity confections. It has to decide which light source is offering the most valid existential geometry. The confusion should last until dawn. I hadn't solved the problem. I had merely provided a more complicated, distracting problem that happened to be made of sugar. This was generally my approach to every major conflict. The princess slowly lowered her licorice baton. She looked down at the egregious shadow at her feet, and for the first time she looked uncertain. The shadow, bathed now in overlapping colors, looked less arrogant and more simply overwhelmed. "The arrogance is diluted," she conceded, nodding slowly. "The visual distortion is distracted. It is contemplating the caloric content of the magenta sphere. This is adequate." The villagers, sensing that the immediate existential threat of municipal relocation was postponed, let out a collective, almost silent sigh of relief, which sounded like wind moving across dry reeds. The rocks, meanwhile, seemed to stop their strained vocalizing. It was possible the sight of 4 glowing candies orbiting overhead had stunned them into operatic silence. My mission, therefore, was complete. The village was neither saved nor destroyed. It was merely confused and slightly sticky. Now the priority shifted entirely. "Princess," I said, already leaning heavily on my slingshot like a cane, "I require a small, dark space suitable for a knight whose armor smells strongly of currency and botanical products, preferably somewhere free of singing minerals." She didn't hesitate. She had seen the solution, appreciated its absurdity, and was ready for the next phase of boredom. "The old pumice storage shed," she instructed one of the villagers. "It's lined with wool blankets, and the door tends to stick, which keeps the light out. It's exactly 3 inches further to the left than the main square, but nobody complains about that." The designated villager, a slender man who moved as if balancing an invisible teacup on his head, immediately began ushering me away from the rock chorus. Barnaby, the carp, gave a final, shimmering flicker, suggesting he understood that his services were now on hold, and began slowly ascending just high enough to enjoy the swirling sugar light show from a comfortable altitude. The pumice shed was exactly as described. Small, dark, and smelling faintly of volcanic ash and forgotten livestock. It was blissfully quiet. The wool blankets, while scratchy, offered a dense muffling effect. I managed to peel off my heavy gauntlets first, the sudden relief of having my hands free feeling like shedding a layer of emotional debt. The sheer weight of the lavender coin armor was now a significant factor in my desire for horizontal repose. I didn't bother attempting to remove the breastplate or the helm. The effort required was greater than my remaining will to live, or at least greater than my will to sit up straight. I settled back against a stack of tightly bound straw bales, the pumice dust tickling my nostrils. My head, still encased in the heavy, scented helm, found a satisfying cradle against the uneven wall. The internal darkness of the helmet, combined with the external darkness of the shed, created a perfect vacuum of visual input. The faint, distant glow of the sugar marbles was barely visible through a thin crack near the shed door. A soft, pulsing, ambient light, providing just enough reassurance that the chaos I had created was still successfully functioning as a distraction. The heavy steel pressed down on me, urging me into the floor, demanding stillness. I tried to recall what I had learned today. 1. Shadows are judgmental. 2. Rocks prefer to sing opera. 3. Barnaby the carp is remarkably patient. 4. My own name remains lost, possibly under a cushion somewhere far away. The sheer exhaustion of carrying the weight of the armor and the weight of the world's illogical problems finally converged. The lavender and copper scent, usually so jarring, now seemed calming, like the smell of a very specific, historically important nightmare. I closed my eyes, a redundant action inside the helm, but satisfying nonetheless. The pressure in my ears subsided. I could hear nothing but the faint, rhythmic clink of the old coins shifting slightly as my body relaxed into the straw. Each clink was a tiny metallic lullaby, counting down the seconds until I was truly gone. My breathing deepened, pulling the scent of dust and ancient finance deeper into my lungs. The ground was cold through the steel boots, but the armor itself held a residual warmth from the day's sunlight, creating a strange dichotomy of temperature that was profoundly comforting. I thought, fleetingly, of the slingshot, still resting beside me. It was a terrible weapon, but an excellent tool for confusion. Perhaps that was what I was, a mechanism for injecting confusion into rigid systems, paving the way for a temporary, sugar-fueled peace, followed by a long, well-deserved nap. The next sound I registered was not the opera rocks, or the princess, or the shuffling of the villagers, but the slow, heavy thudding of my own heart, reverberating dully off the inside of my heavy helm, counting me down into the deep, necessary darkness. The 3-inch shift in the village alignment no longer mattered. The lean of the shadows was immaterial. I was descending slowly into the heavy, quiet indifference of sleep, and honestly, it was the first thing that made perfect sense all day. The weight of the armor was exactly the right weight to hold me in place. Just stay. Just sleep. Just wait until the sugar melts. The end of the world could happen later. The quiet, heavy sleep was coming, smelling sweetly of lavender and the slow, profound decay of ancient currency. I was asleep before I finished wondering if I had remembered to feed Barnaby. It didn't matter. Barnaby knew how to swim in the thick air, and I knew how to stay still. And that was enough resolution for one day.